Good afternoon. We remember meetings, touches, and together times. We feel on smiles and eyes shine. Our chests fill and swell. Hearts burst joy on contact. See, I remember you in good health, smiling as soon as you saw me waiting beyond the steel door. You rushed through laughing. We pressed palms against a steel grating used to hold us apart, your hand and mine barely touching through those diamond-shaped holes. You spoke, breath beating past barriers, and I remember touching you before. The first and last time we had ever touched had been at your resentencing. We shook hands and gave a dap as soon as we met. We had sat watching the charade, thinking of the stiff days ahead we would have to beat. And after the judge closed the book, and just before the helicopter rose, which whisked you away, we embraced, strong, like brothers do, with our arms hard around each other. I remember saying, "Stay strong." And now, with only our fingertips touching, we have come meaning to encourage you and to lift your spirits past captivity. But it is we who are really being encouraged and lifted to higher heights, your strength surging forward from you unto us, raising us, providing persistent resolve to continue. Your revolutionary resistance is more than simply youthful vigor. It is political conviction. It is resilient black manhood. It is consciousness of the new day that steel and cement cannot cage. 6 years ago, during an extended research trip in New Orleans, Louisiana, I came across the following poem by Kalamu Ya Salam, written for Gary Taylor, a young African-American brother who, at the age of 16, was falsely convicted and imprisoned for the murder of a white youth. One of the things that struck me most about the poem was the ways in which it imagined incarcerated bodies, incarcerated black bodies, as not simply objects in need of our political intervention or our academic excellence, but as active subjects, as revolutionary subjects in human history that might actually save us and advance our liberatory discourse. Interestingly enough, about 2 weeks after my encounter with this poem and my first introduction to Gary Taylor, I must admit that I came to Gary Taylor through culture, through art. A local resident who I had gotten familiar with and the chance to know informed me about a conference that he had recently attended. On Friday night, May the 3rd, 2003, an eclectic crowd of 2,000 grassroots activists, labor organizers, students, intellectuals, and concerned citizens gathered in New Orleans, Louisiana for the opening session of the conference, Critical Resistance South, Beyond the Prison Industrial Complex. The keynote address was given by Robert King Wilkerson, internationally known as a member of Angola 3. Wilkerson had spent 29 years in solitary confinement. for his alleged involvement in the April 17, 1972 murder of the prison guard Brent Miller. To an attentive audience that included our guest, Dr. Angela Davis, concerned about the rising rates of incarceration in the South, Wilkerson detailed the many injustices of the penal system, communicated his struggle to maintain his dignity under the most inhumane circumstances, and delivered a handwritten address, a message from two of his incarcerated comrades, Herman Wallace and Alfred Woodfox. Nearly 2 years had passed since Wilkerson's release from Angola, but he was still determined to bring about greater attention to the horrifying reality of incarcerated life. One way he sought to achieve his goal was through the publication of his life story, From the Bottom of the Heap, the autobiography of Black Panther Robert Wilkerson. An engrossing tale that includes very vivid portraits of Wilkerson's dehumanizing experiences as an inmate in Angola, From the Bottom, captures the activist's perennial search for political empowerment, ontological clarity, and existential freedom. In so many ways, Wilkerson's prison narrative represents a continuation of a rich tradition. A tradition that uses culture, music, literary texts as pedagogical tools, humanizing agents, and mobilizing forces in the struggle to either transform or abolish the penal system. To paraphrase our dearly departed sister Audre Lorde, poetry and cultural work for these artists was not a luxury. It was a way of asserting their humanity. Looking very briefly today at 3 cultural texts, the Angola Prison Blues, the Angola Prison Spirituals, and a collection of letters written to the Louisiana Weekly during the 1970s, I want to discuss very briefly the political uses of the prison narrative. To consider the ways in which politically engaged African Americans have sought to build cultures of solidarity within the context of confinement. The ways in which they've also challenged our very notions of freedom. And over the course, I hope to provide some brief overview of Angola, which was regarded as the bloodiest prison in America. One of the things that we cannot forget in our discussions is that the most consistent critics of the penal system have been imprisoned African Americans. Frequently through music, through literature, through poetry, women and men have attempted to wake up the folks in the quasi-free world. And today I will examine how the success of their endeavors and their interventions was very much related to how the Black community thought about the American Democratic Project. Before doing so, let me say a few brief words about Angola. Angola is basically situated on 18,000 acres of land in Louisiana, about 60 miles north of Baton Rouge. Once again, it was routinely referred to as the bloodiest prison in the South. Interestingly enough, Angola was also named after the region from Africa from which most Louisiana planters imported their enslaved labor. Angola transformed from a plantation system to a convict lease system with relative ease. In 1901, the Louisiana State Penitentiary would be controlled by the state. It had been controlled, it was a convict lease system, it had been controlled privately, and then it would become under the control of the state. Mark Carlton would perfectly describe Angola as an economic and sociological anachronism. Angola operated with an inadequate budget, incompetent and underpaid staff who used the most brutal forms of repression and punishment. It's important to understand, however, that Angola inmates did not accept this brutality passively. White as well as black inmates fought back. Early on the morning of February the 19th, 1951, for example, 31 inmates in Camp E would slash their Achilles tendon as a protest against abuse of prison guards. Inspired by their inmates, 6 other men in Camp H, which housed first-time offenders, would follow suit. A Washington Post article reported that the protesters then proceeded to hop, quote, about their barracks in a weird snake dance, trailing blood and singing Hill Stream Boogie. Facing pressure from the press as well as the public, Governor Long would implement several reform measures, but it's important to note that these reform measures would not impact African American inmates. Oppressive conditions continued for African American inmates in Angola. Sun-up to sundown work conditions taxed black bodies beyond the point of exhaustion. On one day, in 1935, for example, 5 African Americans would die within an hour. On top of these harsh working conditions, blacks endured segregated and unequal living quarters and eating facilities, inadequate medical care, and abusive treatment from convict-turned guardsmen. Fiercely determined to improve their situation, African Americans would go on strike on May the 20th, 1952. And why this is so important is because it demonstrates in many ways, for those of us who are interested in labor history, one of the most important places to begin to examine labor history and working class resistance is actually in the prisons. They would go on strike and they would basically stay in their cells for 5 hours until troops from Baton Rouge as well as New Orleans arrive in Angola. And they would set off 3 tear gas bombs. Choking inmates hurriedly vacated their cells as angry guards pounded the dissidents with baseball hats and sticks. One inmate recalled that you thought they were having a ball game out there. Some were running and some were hollering, but that didn't help them at all because they was knocking home runs on their heads, back, just anywhere they could get a lick. Them guards was having no mercy. Not an isolated incident, the Angola strike was very much part of a larger movement. In 1952, there would be more than 23 inmate uprisings across the nation. Unfortunately, black prisoner struggles for justice received no attention. A burgeoning civil rights movement raged in America during the 1950s, but black inmates received no attention. However, in many ways, their opportunity would come in 1957 when the folklorist Harry Oyster comes to Angola to record spirituals, blues, folk songs from these inmates. And in many ways, these inmates use this opportunity to publicize conditions in Angola, capturing in many ways what literary critic Houston Baker defines as the poetry of impulse. These musicians presented black articulateness and lyricism in the very face of violence, catastrophe, rejection, and exploitation. These songs would detail the harsh working conditions that they endured. One song, for example, would refer to Angola as a murderer's home. But not simply concerned with the physical abuse or material deprivation, prison inmates also gave voice to the existential pain and anguish of prison life. On a song called Prisoners Talking Blues, for example, Robert Pete Williams moans, "Sometimes I feel like baby committing suicide." These prisoners were not afraid to demonstrate their vulnerability, and they were not afraid to sort of verbalize pains and longings frequently relegated to the private realm. However, these prisoners also demonstrated and also articulated their desire for self-determination, for self-definition, for spiritual rehabilitation, and also for transcendence. A confluence of forces: racism, the penal system, capitalism, economic deprivation, the harsh realities of prison life, systematically attempted to dehumanize inmates. Yet many inmates refused to embrace a politics of despair. And nothing demonstrates this more than, I think, their engagement with the secular world. I'm going to stop for a brief minute, and I want to play a song by Roosevelt Charles, who was the leader of the 1952 strike. And I think it demonstrates the sort of religiosity in their search for transcendence. So.
Moses, we will start rolling, go down, Moses, we down, Moses, in Egypt land, till old Pharaoh, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down, Moses, in Egypt, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. Where you go when I'll go with you. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down, Moses, in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. Well, now, I tell you what I want you to do. Want you to go along and tell old Pharaoh, let my people go now.
When he gives an account of the strike in 1952, when they released that record in 1960, they don't include his account of the strike. They don't include it in reissues as well until 2002. And that's very important. But years later, when he's interviewed and he talks about this and he understands that they didn't release his account of the strike, he still views these spirituals as very much a part of his articulation of freedom. But most importantly, his articulation of his humanity. To sort of speed things up, let me just say this. These albums, the Angola Spirituals, the Angola Blues, the Angola Prison Work Songs, are released in 1960, but there's no immediate response. Because in some ways, the civil rights movement during this particular time is not seeing this as a sort of question of freedom in some ways. However, things changed dramatically in the mid-1960s, and things changed dramatically with the development of the Black Power movement. And it is really between 1965 and 1975 that you really begin to see a sort of mass movement around these critical issues. There's a reason in some ways that the Angola spirituals are not as, say, popular as Archie Shepp's Attica Blues in 1971, but we have to understand that within the context of the political moment. But I think we also have to understand the difference in responses to this political moment to also what's going on in terms of the particular demands that African Americans are making between 1965 and 1975 and the type of political critiques that they're beginning to articulate in terms of Western democracy, because it is between 1965 and 1975 that African Americans are also beginning to question the idea of Western perfectibility. And that questioning, I think, of Western perfectibility and the American Democratic Project plays a critical role in how the entire community thinks about the injustices that are happening at places like Angola. I want to fast forward. How am I doing with time?
1 more minute.
1 more minute. Okay. Well, you know what? I'm going to stop there so all my panelists will have adequate time. But one of the things that I sort of wanted to talk about going from the Angola prison songs to the 1970s and looking at these letters that African American prisoners began to write to Louisiana Weekly, is the ways in which they're not only providing a critique of the penal system, but they're also providing a strident critique of American capitalism. And as we think about democracy and as we think about prison reform and the abolition of prisons, I think we really need to think about and connect that to a larger discussion about capitalism and the future of the Black liberation struggle and how we want to construct that future. Thank you.